think she came up even before we knew.
Can I get a glass of water from you guys, maybe? Oh, I see. All right, we got everyone here? Cool. All right, everyone, welcome to our second Rosh Christi meeting this semester. This is Rosh Christi, and those are Latin words that mean the reason of Christ. And what we do here is we're an apologetics organization. We talk about the various arguments for why we believe that Christianity is true. A couple things. I guess this is the theme for our semester, what is morally right? So we'll be discussing that throughout the semester. And we have a big event that we're planning on doing in late September. It's called God Morality, What is the Best Account for Objective Morality? And we'll have our own Dr. Adam Johnson and Dr. Alec Wielenberg discussing where morality comes from. And so look forward to that, and if you want one of these flyers, you can grab them on the table back there. What else? So before these meetings, we meet on campus at the Union for supper at 6 if you want to join us, or if you need a ride, we leave at 7. So yeah, I believe that's all. And without further ado, I will give it over to Adam Johnson.
All right, everybody take a deep breath. Whew. We made it, our first night. It was kind of chaotic this afternoon. We had to, at the last minute, kind of change locations. But thank you for Ben and Janae for hosting tonight. This looks like it'll work really well. One of the things we like to do in Rosh Christi is to get me to shut up. So about every 10 to 15 minutes, I will try to shut up and give you guys a chance to discuss. Now, normally we have you guys sit around tables so you can do that, and in this environment it'll be a little bit different, but we're still going to try that. So just think about it. Maybe 10, 15 minutes from now, you can break up and just have a little discussion, 3-4 here, 3-4 there, and we'll do the best we can. Well, those watching online and those of you that are here, when you get back on technology, or if you have your phones handy, it would be great if you could help us promote the ministry. We can't really interact or help people unless they know that we're here. And one of the ways we do that is through social media. So we try to put these live on YouTube, as well as just have them available on YouTube afterwards for people to watch if they want to later. But if you like, subscribe, share this stuff on social media, then that helps more people to know that we're here and we want to serve them in this particular area of apologetics. Well, as Matt said, we're talking about morality this semester. What is morally right is our theme. And I'm really excited about this theme because this is what I spent the last 6 to 7 years working on my PhD all about. So in my PhD, philosophy of religion, I was able to concentrate in this area specifically of ethics, and really something even a little bit deeper than ethics. Sometimes people refer to it as metaethics, which answers different types of questions. But we'll walk through that tonight and try to explain what I mean by that. Well, we're going to start the semester with kind of a fundamental question, and that is, what makes something morally right or wrong in the first place? What makes something morally right or wrong, or good or bad, in the first place? As I said, sometimes this is called metaethics. And most people are familiar with the term ethics, right? We have ethical conversations and we discuss various issues like the death penalty or abortion. Some people would say abortion is okay, morally permissible, or it's good. Some people would say it's bad. And those are the ethical disagreements, the ethical conversations that we often have. And there's other topics that we discuss in that arena as well. But metaethics, and you can kind of tell just from the way the word is shaped, metaethics, is about deeper stuff. So in metaethics, some of the things that are discussed are, is there even such a thing as objective moral truth? Is morality even a real thing, an objective thing? Or is it just our subjective, either individual opinions or cultural opinions, feelings, emotions? Another thing that's discussed in metaethics is how can we know what is morally true? If there is such a thing as objective morality, how do we know it? This has to do with epistemology, of course. How do we know things? In this case, how do we know moral truth, if there is such a thing? And then the last thing, and this is what we're going to focus on tonight, if you can see the screen, is what makes something good or bad. So for example, most people would agree that rape is morally bad. But they might disagree on what makes it bad. You see the difference? And oftentimes, our moral disagreements will stem from our metaethical positions. So sometimes we'll disagree on an ethical issue, but the reason we're disagreeing is because we have a different metaethical position. We disagree on what makes something morally bad. Now, of course, there's various theories about what makes something bad or what makes something good. I just threw up a couple here on this slide. But these are fairly common. So take a look at various theories about what makes something bad. Some people would say, well, if an activity or an action causes pain or hurts other people, that's what makes it a bad thing to do. Others would say, well, if the majority of people or maybe the culture that you live in says it's bad, then that's what makes it bad. Some would say, right, that something is bad if God commands against it. That's a theory about what makes something bad. What about what makes something good? So some people would say that something is morally good, an action that I would do, it's morally good. What makes it good is that it reflects God's character or God's nature in some way. Some people say that what makes something good is if it increases the total amount of pleasure in the world. Others would say that something is good if it comes from within you. Let's say maybe your genuine or your authentic self. That's what makes something good, if it comes from within, from your true heart. Others would say what makes something good is if it leads to human flourishing, overall human flourishing. Then that's something that's good. So oftentimes when we disagree about ethical issues, not always, like I said, you can agree that rape is wrong and have a different metaethical position. But oftentimes in our ethical positions, the reason we disagree on them is because we have a different metaethical foundation. So sometimes it's useful to step back from the actual issues themselves and think through this metaethical stuff. Because then we're not necessarily talking past each other. We're understanding why they or another group disagrees with us on an ethical position. Well, it's because they have a different metaethical understanding of what makes something wrong in the first place. So I'm going to give you guys a chance to discuss a little bit now. And do your best just to break up in groups here, 3, 4, 5 here. Turn your chairs around for just a few minutes, and I'll give you some time to discuss this question. What do you think makes something morally good or bad? And I'll put this up so you can see various examples of what others have put forth. You can argue for one of those, or maybe another one, position that you've heard of or that you hold yourself. So go ahead and discuss this question. What do you think makes something morally good or bad?
She wanted her to campus.
Yeah, this is a really good.
Yeah, I went back to our house to get her because she wanted her to campus, and then there's all the ice stuff was still in the way, so she was trying to like do that by the time she got to our house.
All right, one of the most challenging parts of Ratio Christi is trying to take back control as the lecturer. And I hate doing it because I overhear your guys' discussions, and they are great conversations to have. But as we often say, we hope that these 3-4 minute time periods are just the beginning of your conversations. That afterwards you can continue to talk. Tomorrow you guys can meet up, get coffee, and talk. These are just supposed to be the beginning of conversations. We can't settle things in 3 minutes, usually. Now I have to warn you about the next slide. The next slide is pretty scary, so you might want to cover your eyes. Pretty intense. Are you ready? Enough setup? I knew it was going to be rough. Every field has its jargon, right? And you guys know this. Whatever field you're studying in college, you've got to learn the jargon. And a lot of times the jargon itself doesn't even make sense. I mean, just think about Republicans and Democrats. Are Republicans more for republics and Democrats more for democracies? No. They're just names that have developed over the years, and we're stuck with them. So even some of the terminology in metaethics at first, like all jargon, doesn't make sense. It's just what people use, and you got to get used to it. Now, as far as I know, none of you are studying metaethics. If you are, you'll have to learn this stuff. But if you're not, we're going to keep it very, very simple, okay? We're just going to oversimplify. Those of you that are watching who know about metaethics, I'm going to do something terrible and oversimplify and overgeneralize, and we're just going to narrow it down to this. So the idea that morality is objective, or the idea that morality is subjective. I will say that if you want to go further and learn the jargon and learn about all the positions, because there are a lot of different positions, I recommend this book. This was written by a professor at the University of Nebraska, Mark Van Rooyen, I want to say is the name. I might be mispronouncing it. But I've met him a couple times down at the university, and he published this book through Rutledge, just called Metaethics, A Contemporary Introduction. And so he's not taking necessarily a position in this, he's just going through and he's explaining the history of metaethics and the various positions that have developed over the centuries. So this would be a good resource if you want to learn the jargon. But as I said, we're going to keep it simple for the sake of this series. Now, I will say one thing about this, though. If we zoom in here and take a look at, if you can see it from the back, the yellow, for those of you that can't, this section here called realism. Now, oftentimes people will use moral realism and objective morality. They'll use those two terms interchangeably. But technically, that's not correct. Because there are some forms, as you can see, of constructivism that do affirm objective morality. So these positions have been developed, moral realism, to just clarify that no, if you hold one of these positions, you affirm not only that morality is objectively true, but that it's morally, that they're real. And you might think, well, what's the difference between objectively true and real? And that's where you should dive into this. But I just wanted to clarify that the conversation we're going to be focusing on is technically in this area of moral realism. So that's the one jargon you get to learn tonight, moral realism. And as you'll see, there's three types here. There's naturalism, non-naturalism, which is sometimes called robust realism, and then supernaturalism, which is what we would be as Christians. We would affirm moral realism, but a supernatural flavor of moral realism. And Van Rooyen breaks that all out here in this book. But as I said, we're going to keep it simple for the sake of this series. And let's just explain what it means to be subjective and objective. Now, I think you guys probably get that idea. If something is subjective, it's not necessarily objectively true. It has more to do with your own personal preferences. So we could talk about the flavor of ice cream, right? There's not an objectively true or objectively correct flavor of ice cream. Now, that might start a fight here in the room, might break out over this. But we understand, some people like chocolate, some people like vanilla. There's some crazy people in the room who might like pistachio, right? But that's a subjective thing. Humor is subjective as well, right? So I think you understand if morality was subjective, then it's more about your personal opinion, your feelings, your emotions, your own attitudes, but there's no objective moral truth. So if that's the case, if that's what morality really is, if it's subjective, then we can't really condemn anything as objectively wrong. We could say we don't like racism or we don't like rape, but we couldn't say it's objectively wrong if morality was subjective. Of course, the opposite then is the positions over here which would affirm objective morality. That no, they would disagree with those on the right and say moral truth is something that exists objectively in some way, shape, or form. Even those who affirm that have different explanations of it, but they would agree that it's objective. The realist would go even further and say it's objectively real. So what does it mean to be objectively true? Well, here's a good quote from our favorite philosopher, Alvin Plantinga. And he said, moral truths are objective, and he goes on to give a description of what he means by that. Moral truths are objective in the sense that they're in a certain way independent of human beliefs and desires. So it's wrong to torture people for the fun of it, and that would remain wrong even if somehow most or all of the world's population came to believe that this behavior is acceptable, and indeed came to desire that it be much more widely practiced. So the fun example that's always used is if, let's say somehow somebody put in the water supply or somebody gave us a pill somehow that made us all think tomorrow that rape was morally acceptable. If we all believe that tomorrow, would that make rape be morally acceptable? No, I think we would say if we're a believer in objective morality, that no, even if we all thought that, that still wouldn't make it morally right. So in terms of the major debates in metaethics, that's the first one. Is morality subjective or objective? And then here's another big one, number 2 there. If it is objective, if morality is objective, then how do we explain it? And this is what all the various positions are that I showed you on that screen. Where does it come from? How can it exist out there apart from us? What is the foundation of morality? So those are some of the big issues that are discussed in metaethics. So that's just a little bit of an introduction, and what I'd like to do really for most of the rest of the time tonight is just kind of give you a historical background of this conversation, okay? I think it'll be really useful before we dive into the conversation to know what has come before us, right? So to know what the major positions are and how they've changed recently, the majority position in our culture, so on and so forth. So we're going to do just some historical background about these issues. Now, a lot of my information is coming tonight from, getting ahead of myself here, a guy by the name of, no, let me start back. A guy by the name of Alistair MacIntyre. So a lot of the historical information that I'm giving you tonight comes from this book. And I'll tell you more about him. I have a whole slide dedicated to him and his background here in just a few minutes. I'll tell you more about him. But let me start out saying that for centuries, most Western thinkers, at least, thought that God was the best explanation for objective morality. Okay? So here's a quote from Bagot and Walls. This is a book two philosophers published. They co-wrote it, published by Oxford University Press. This comes from their book, Bagot and Walls. They wrote that the authority of moral obligations needs an account. And theism, they're taking a position in this book, they're making an argument. They're arguing that theism, which entails a loving God, perfect God, who commands, knows us better than we know ourselves, knows truly what's in our ultimate best interest, and who desires the best for us, can, we submit, they're arguing, most effectively provide. So as I said, most Western thinkers throughout history argued that if there is objective morality, then God is the best explanation for it. So they agreed that God is the ultimate foundation for morality, but they disagreed as to how God serves as that foundation. Does that make sense? So even within Christendom, even within, Christian thinkers, there's disagreements even today about how God serves as the source and foundation of morality. So here are some things that have been thrown out over the years. Is God the source of morality through his commands? By creating a human nature with a certain purpose? Through ideas in God's mind? Because of his moral nature, through his will? Or by being the moral exemplar, the moral standard himself? So even among the thinkers who have said God is the best explanation, they disagree as to how God is that foundation. So I'll give you guys some time to discuss this, break up into small groups again, and talk about this. First of all, what do you think is the best explanation for objective morality? And if you answer God, then how do you think he is the source of morality? Maybe one of these options, or maybe you bring another option to the table. Okay? So do you guys see the question? I'll give you a few minutes to discuss it. right. Let me interrupt you, and we'll move on with this historical background. Now, not only did the thinkers from the Abrahamic religions affirm that God is the source of morality. When I say Abrahamic religions, I'm talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Of course, those thinkers in Western history affirmed that God is the best explanation of morality. But not only them. There were many ancient Greek philosophers which also proposed that objective morality had a transcendent source. And in fact, some of these ancient Greek philosophers described the transcendent source of morality in many of the same ways that the Abrahamic religions explained or described God. So take a look at Aristotle. He argued that there must be a first unmoved mover, which is God. He used the word Theos, where we get theology, the Greek word for supreme being, Theos. A living, intelligent, incorporeal, eternal, and most good, most morally good being who is the source of order in the cosmos. Another famous ancient Greek philosopher, Plato, he argued, very interestingly, how he came to this conclusion. He argued that this physical world, including us, because we're part of the physical world, could never be the source for truth, fixed objective truth, because the physical world is always changing. And so it's not stable enough, if you will, to be the foundation for objective truth. And so Plato has this whole theory, his forms, Plato's forms. He posited that there are these universal truths that exist out there. And they are absolute, they are objective, and they're separate from this physical world that's always changing, always in flux. And went on to suggest that there was a divine craftsman who used these objective truths then in making this physical world. So that's what he posited out there. Now, a lot of the history that I'm giving you tonight is from, as I said, this gentleman, Alistair MacIntyre, but I wanted you to see some of his credentials. He's one of those wandering professors that pretty much has taught everywhere, right? From Oxford, Notre Dame, Duke, Vanderbilt, Boston University, Yale, Princeton. And he converted to Christianity later in life, around the age of 50, in the early 1980s. He describes his work as, get this, those of you that know Christian theologians from history, he describes his work as an Augustinian Thomist approach to moral philosophy. Whereas Augustine and Aquinas are like two of the biggest figures from Christian theology, Christian history. His book here, After Virtue, many recognize as one of the most important works of moral philosophy in the 20th century. So you can read more about him online, but a lot of the history I'm giving you tonight is from this gentleman. I wanted you to be aware. Now, he calls this view that I'm describing here, this view which is, part and parcel of Christian, Abrahamic religion, and also Greek philosophy. He just lumps that all together, this idea that God is the best explanation for objective morality. He just describes that whole view, that whole position, everybody who affirms that, as the classical tradition. So just some of that technical jargon, that was his term. He called it the classical tradition. And he explained that even after writing After Virtue, his book, he became a Thomist, in part because I came to be convinced that Aquinas was in some respects a better Aristotelian than Aristotle himself. And Thomas Aquinas, of course, is a Christian theologian. I had learned from Aquinas that my attempt to provide an account of the human good was bound to be inadequate until I had provided it with a metaphysical grounding. So good source. I think it's good for students to have good academic sources like this. Now, throughout his book, he kind of gives a history of this conversation, which I think is really, really helpful. But let me try to summarize what he said. He argued that when this classical theistic position was rejected in the modern era, when our culture, the majority of our culture, rejected this classical tradition, various thinkers then tried but failed, according to MacIntyre, failed to establish a new foundation for objective morality. I mean, without God, how could objective morality exist apart from our own ideas and preferences? If there wasn't a fixed point, some sort of absolute standard, if you will, no ultimate purpose for humanity, then how could our moral beliefs be anything more than just our mere opinions? Now, of course, some did claim that these new modern theories could sustain objective morality, but MacIntyre in his book argues that they failed. And instead, all that they provided were rival and incompatible accounts. Utilitarianism, Kantianism, contractarianism, all these different isms, but according to MacIntyre, they all failed to develop that foundation for objective morality, even though they tried to do it without God. What happened, according to MacIntyre, was that eventually our moral judgments just became essentially expressions of our attitudes and feelings. This is kind of where our cultural understanding moved to in terms of their understanding of morality. Expressivism, emotism. Our moral judgments are just our emotions and our feelings and our expressions of them. So this led many to the horrifying conclusion that objective morality was just a theater of illusions, and then this paved the way, of course, for subjective and then relative morality to be a very common position in our Western culture. Now, I really appreciate how MacIntyre points out how influential and important Nietzsche played in this whole conversation. It might sound kind of strange to you, but in effect, at least in this conversation, Nietzsche is an unlikely ally to us Christians in this conversation. Nietzsche, if you don't know, was that famous philosopher in the late 1800s who proclaimed that God is dead, right? You guys know who Nietzsche is. Now, he was an atheist. He never believed that there was a God, and then he got sick and died, right? That's not what he was saying when he said God is dead. What he meant by that was just that the idea of God was having much less influence on society than it used to, and in people's individual lives. And in that respect, I could agree with Nietzsche. In that sense, I think God has died for Western culture, the idea of God, that is. But in this conversation, why Nietzsche is so helpful, especially according to MacIntyre, because Nietzsche points out the failure of all of these modern attempts to build a foundation for objective morality without God. So I'm just going to give you a few quotes from MacIntyre, who was pointing out some of the things that Nietzsche argued. Says his critique, Nietzsche's critique of modern philosophy, and particularly of modern moral philosophy, comes precisely from his conviction that a genuinely objective moral order would require a God as its foundation. This conviction of Nietzsche's gave rise to a scathing critique of any secular moralists of his day who thought they could hold on to objective morality without God. So bottom line is, Nietzsche said, if there is no God, which he as an atheist, he believed that, then there can't be anything like objective morality that really exists. So he was one of those that would affirm, yes, if there is such a thing as objective morality, God is the best explanation for it. But, he said, there is no God and there is no objective morality, according to Nietzsche. Nietzsche sharply ridiculed as naive anyone who thought that morality could survive when the God who sanctioned it is missing or dead. MacIntyre argued that Nietzsche wittingly demolished the modern project to discover rational foundations for an objective morality. And he wrote, this is my last quote here, from McIntyre. McIntyre wrote that it was Nietzsche's historic achievement to understand more clearly than any other philosopher not only that what purported to be appeals to objectivity were in fact expressions of subjective will, but also the nature of the problems that this posed for moral philosophy. Now, Nietzsche's not the only atheist who argued that without God there could not be objective morality. I'm going to give you several quotes now from other atheist thinkers over the last 100 years who also affirmed this, along with Nietzsche. So take a look here at existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. He wrote that there can no longer be an a priori good, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it. If God does not exist, we find no values or commands to turn to which legitimize our conduct. Richard Taylor is another one. He wrote that the modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong, not noticing that in casting God aside, they've also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. Elsewhere he wrote, the concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but the meaning is gone. Last one, this comes from J.L. Mackie. If you can read that, that's pretty small font. In chapter 1, the chapter's called The Subjectivity of Values, in his book Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. In this first chapter, Mackie launched his argument with this sentence: there are no objective values. Now, Mackie labeled his view error theory because he claimed that although most people in making moral judgments implicitly claim, among other things, to be pointing to something objectively prescriptive, those claims are in fact all false. That's why he called his position the error theory. He admitted, though, and this is very interesting, the last quote down there at the bottom, he said, objective intrinsically prescriptive features supervening upon natural ones constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. If, again, this is a conditional, he doesn't believe in God, he's an atheist, but he affirms this conditional. If, then, there are such intrinsically prescriptive objective values, if there is such a thing as objective morality, they make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. So it's these sort of atheists who are helpful to us as theists, as Christians in this conversation, because they're affirming what we do, the conditional that objective morality requires a theistic God. Now, they don't believe that there is a God, so they don't believe in objective morality, but they affirm the same conditional that we're arguing for. As you can imagine, other atheists said, not so fast. Roll back the trolley here. Even if there is no God, maybe objective morality could exist on its own. Maybe there's another foundation for objective morality, or maybe objective morality doesn't need a foundation. So some atheists have argued for this position. And probably the most famous on this side, in this group, is a guy by the name of G.E. Moore. He's the handsome fellow smoking a pipe there. Now, his book in 1903, Principia Ethica, I believe it's pronounced, had a huge impact on metaethics. Okay, I can't overstate this enough. So his book, G.E. Moore, 1903, was a huge contribution to this conversation. And he was one of those atheists who did believe in objective morality and thought that objective morality could exist even if there was no God. Okay? Now, one of the things he's most famous for is his open question argument. Okay? And this isn't necessarily directed at theistic positions per se. It's actually more an argument against naturalistic positions. So let me just set up his famous argument for you. It's the open question argument. Now, he said that others before him, other philosophers, had mistakenly defined moral goodness by identifying it with a certain natural property. Just take a simple one. Just take like utilitarianism, right? Something is wrong if it hurts others, or something is wrong if it causes others pain. Okay? So the avoidance of pain or human pleasure is what makes something morally good. But More's open question argument basically said that no matter what property one claims is identical with moral goodness, it's always going to be an open question whether or not that property is itself good, right? So go back to the idea that the avoidance of pain is what is morally good. Well, you have to take a step back and ask, well, why? What makes the avoidance of pain a good thing, right? You can see how you would have a regress here. And in fact, that's exactly what he said. No matter what property, no matter what natural property you put forth as to what makes something morally good, it's always an open question whether that thing itself is morally good. Why think that the avoidance of pain is a good thing? Why think that that's good? So he said the only solution to stop this regress then, the only solution was to conclude that moral goodness is its own separate, non-reductive, get this, non-natural property. Similar, many people have pointed out, similar to Plato's idea of abstract objects. Similar to Plato's idea of these universal truths that just exist out there in some way, shape, or form. So More is putting forth this idea that we should reject naturalism. Okay, and by naturalism tonight, I mean just that the only thing that exists is the material, physical universe. He's putting forth this idea that there's more to reality than just the physical, material universe. He's rejecting naturalism by proposing these non-natural properties of moral goodness, similar to Plato's theory. And so if you remember, going back to all of this jargon, right, I said we were going to focus our time here on realism. Really, it lays out for us these three positions then. You've got naturalism, the idea that all that exists is the material, physical universe, and somehow moral goodness is associated with some sort of a physical, natural property. More shot that down. He argued against that. And he proposed the second option, non-naturalism. Okay? And then, of course, our position as Christians is supernaturalism. So More's work, I just can't overstate how influential it's been in this conversation of objective morality and moral realism. So if you're still a little bit confused about Platonism and abstract objects and how all that, think about just numbers for a moment. You know, a lot of people would affirm that numbers somehow exist on their own, like the number 7. You know, you can't go and dig up the number 7 somewhere. It's an abstract concept that is a truth that exists on its own, right? Even if there was no physical material universe, the number 7 and all numbers and mathematical truths would exist in that way. A lot of people would feel comfortable with that idea. And he was just saying more, as an atheist, that that's how moral truths exist, that they just exist like these mathematical truths out there apart from the physical material universe. But of course he, as an atheist, denied all of the theistic aspects of Plato's view. So I'm going to give you guys time to discuss. I've been talking for a while, and I want you to discuss this question amongst yourselves just for a few minutes. What do you think of More's proposal, first of all? And then, what would you guess was his most common criticism? Folks that disagreed with More, what do you think they criticized, the most common criticism of More's position? Or what's your criticism of it? So go ahead, I'll give you a few minutes to discuss. All right. Well, I overheard a lot of you say this. So the most common criticism of More's position was, of course, his non-naturalism. So especially in the 20th century, naturalism was, for the most part, king, right? The idea that all that exists is the physical material universe. And for him to propose this idea that there were things that existed beyond the physical universe, you know, in a lot of circles, that's a big no-no. So it was actually the naturalists who critiqued More the most. Because no, they said naturalism is it. You know, the physical material universe, that's all there is, and you're proposing these excessive ontological new things out there which kind of sound religious, that something is out there beyond the universe. And so a lot of naturalists then critiqued More's position for this, as they put it, an excessive ontology, an excessive amount of things in reality. Because according to naturalists, the only things that exist in reality is the physical, material universe. So, as you can imagine, MacIntyre is not a fan of More's position. He critiqued it as well, but MacIntyre, being a supernaturalist, critiqued it for other reasons. And he argued that More's proposal failed and tried to show, as a philosopher, that when people eventually rejected More's Platonism, his excessive ontology, that his position boiled down to emotivism, the idea that moral judgments are just an expression of our emotions. That wherever you find the emotivism, it's usually following a rejection, a trying of More's position, but then a failing of it, and then it just boils down to, degenerates back down to subjective morality, according to MacIntyre. Now, what's interesting, especially for our conversation over the next month here, is that More's position, even though, he wrote his big book about it in 1903, his position has actually surged in popularity lately, especially among atheists. So I'm going to give you a whole host of names here of atheists. These are atheist philosophers, academic philosophy professors who are affirming nowadays More's position, or something very similar to More's position, non-naturalism, it's often referred to. So you've got names up here like Russ Schaefer Landau, I believe it's pronounced, Colin McGinn, Michael Huemer, William Fitzpatrick, David Enoch, Derek Parfit, and Eric Wielenberg, who we're bringing to UNL next month to speak, to have a dialogue with me up on stage. So this position, More's position, has really surged in popularity as over the last 20 or 30 years. And I'm very thankful, right, that they're affirming objective morality. I think that's a great thing, because I believe in objective morality. However, they think that objective morality can exist even if there is no God. So I'll give you an example here. Here's Russ Schaefer Landau. He wrote that the purpose of his book was to defend the theory that moral judgments enjoy a special sort of objectivity, that such judgments, when true, are so independently of what any human being anywhere, in any circumstance, whatever, thinks of them. So very similar to what Planicus said at the beginning of the lecture, if you remember, right? Another one of these modern-day Morean champions is David Enoch. And he described objective morality as the position that he affirms, that there are response-independent, irreducibly normative truths, objective ones, that when successful in our normative inquiries, we discover rather than create or construct. Now get this, I think this is a fascinating quote from his book. So this is David Enoch, atheist, taking morality seriously, a defense of robust realism. Remember I said robust realism, just in the jargon, is another name for non-naturalism in this conversation. But he's got this fascinating quote. Listen to this. Enoch wrote, when he was first defending his position in 2003, so almost 20 years ago, when he was first defending his position, I claimed the great philosophical advantage of being in the ridiculed minority, putting forward a view that many don't think is even worth considering. But this view is now making an impressive comeback, and then he noted how Stephen Finley classifies it now as the dominant view. So this, idea of relative subjective morality seems to be on the way out among, atheists and these sort of thinkers, And this non-naturalism, this affirmation of objective morality seems to be the new wave, okay? In fact, this will be interesting to you. Christian philosopher C. Stephen Evans, he agreed with Enoch's definition of objective morality and said even that his book here is the most comprehensive and sophisticated defense of objective morality in all of the philosophical literature. So you've got a Christian philosopher saying this atheist philosopher has done the best job at defending the existence of objective morality out there in the literature, which is pretty amazing. Now, of course, he believes in objective morality, but doesn't think that God is necessary for it. So that's where I would respectfully disagree with him. Now, the last thing I want to point out to you tonight is, we'll be done soon, there's also been a surge in supernatural moral realism over the last 30, 40 years, okay? So I want to close tonight just showing you some of these theistic thinkers who have proposed very sophisticated supernatural theories of objective morality as well, and give you some of their backgrounds. So one of my favorites is a guy by the name of John Hare. A lot of my dissertation, I gleaned insight from him. And I'm going to give you where their degrees are from and then where they've been a professor. So if you can see the screen here, where John Hare studied and where he's taught. He's at Yale right now. But he, similar to these non-naturalists, he, talking about supernatural moral realism, wrote that no one looking at the discipline in the late 1960s, when I was doing my training, would have predicted the existence of this series. He goes on to talk about all the theistic philosophers who are writing books in this area. These titles and others like them are a manifestation within ethical theory of a much larger shift within the discipline. And the reason that I give this to you guys, especially you guys, most of you are Christians, I want you to be aware that there is some great work being done now at the highest level in philosophy. Some of the top schools, degrees, and professors at, and you'll see as I go through them. So I don't want you to feel embarrassed if you stand up for supernatural positions of objective morality, because this is a conversation that's taking place at some of the highest levels in academia. And you can quote these guys, right? I mean, you probably can't quote your pastor, when you're writing a paper at the university, but you can quote these guys. And they've built and are building very sophisticated models, theories, if you will, of objective morality based on God being the source and foundation of morality. Some of the highest academic credentials you can get. So here's just a few. You got Robert Adams, degrees from Princeton, Oxford, Cornell. He's been a professor, Yale, Oxford, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Robert Audie, degrees from University of Michigan. He was a professor at the University of Texas, Austin, and at UNL. He was one of our UNL philosophy professors for decades. I think over 20 years. I think he was the chair of our philosophy department at the University of Nebraska. And we're bringing him to speak at UNL next spring. Okay, so very high level. Right now he's a professor at Notre Dame. Very high level, and he affirms, supernatural moral realism. Two more guys. I mentioned before C. Stephen Evans, degrees from Wheaton, Yale. Now he's a professor at Baylor. Mark Murphy got his degree at Notre Dame, University of Texas, Austin, and now he's a professor at Georgetown. Two more real quick. I just want you to be familiar with some of these names, and you can learn more about them online, obviously, get some of their books, quote them, use them as you write your own papers. Philip Quinn, degrees from Georgetown, University of Delaware, University of Pittsburgh, and professor at Notre Dame. Linda Zagzebski, I always find it a challenge to say her last name. Degrees from Stanford, Berkeley, University of California, Los Angeles, and right now is a professor at the University of Oklahoma, so not too far away. She wrote a great book called Virtue Ethics. that I would recommend. So, last question of the night, and I've got just a few more minutes I want to talk at you. But before I do that, let me give you guys some time to discuss this last discussion question. So, how should Christians respond to this topic, especially in light of its recent historical development? It's kind of a leading question because I have some thoughts about this. But before I give you my thoughts, I want you to be able to share your thoughts with each other. So how should Christians respond to this? What are your thoughts? What is your response if you're a Christian? Or if you're not a Christian, how should you think Christians should respond? And especially in light of this last few decades of changes in the field that I've explained. So I'll give you a few minutes to discuss, and then I'll wrap it up just a couple minutes after that. It is time for a shameless plug.
Oh boy, plugging it in.
Shameless.
Shameless plug.
So, if you're interested in this conversation, this topic, I wrote the first chapter in this book, and it'll have a lot of these quotes, and then, you can't quote me through them, get their quotes, but at least you have the footnotes and the references. You can find those quotes here in the first chapter. I wrote the intro to this book, and then this was published by the same publisher, Routledge, that published the book by the professor at UNL, just on Metaethics. It's the same publisher, Routledge. But what this book is about is I got William Lane Craig, who's a Christian philosopher, to debate one of these modern Morians, Eric Wielenberg, a non-naturalist who affirms objective morality without God. And I got them to have a debate at NC State University a couple years ago. We had 1,200 people show up for the debate. It was a great time. I got a chance to moderate the debate. And then just recently we put it together in a book format. So there's a transcript of the debate, and then we invited 5 other philosophers to write chapters responding to the debate. 3 Christian philosophers and 2 atheist philosophers. And then Wielenberg and Craig both write concluding chapters, responding to the 5 responders. So it's a great, I think, book. But I love these sort of debate books because within one volume, you get to see both positions. And you get to see both people critique each other and defend their own position in one volume. So I've always found debate books helpful, and I hope this one will be as well. I got to serve as the overall editor and then write the first introductory chapter. And a lot of that is what I provided you tonight. Historical background, just an introduction to the conversation. But the reason that I was motivated to, be a part of that conversation is because my position on this is that Christians need to move forward in this conversation. The vast majority of Christian apologists and philosophers have spent most of their time arguing against subjective morality or arguing against relative morality. And that was legitimate last century. That was appropriate in the 1900s because, postmodernism and relative morality and subjective morality, all that stuff was running rampant. But the conversation is shifting. And as I pointed out, a lot of atheists and some of these very sophisticated atheist philosophers are coming out for objective morality. So I think as Christian philosophers, I would encourage us to shift gears and stop arguing against subjective morality, relative morality, and start focusing our time on these new non-theistic models of objective morality. I'm thankful for these folks that they affirm objective absolute morality. I think that's a great thing. But it's still, we would respectfully disagree with them when they say that that can be such, even though there is no God. So that's where I'm focusing my attention, and I think we just generally need to focus in that direction. Now, the other big shift I see in it is a lot of Christian philosophers still want to beat over the head reductive materialists, right? But it feels like we're kind of beating a dead horse. I mean, there's so much work out there, even by atheist philosophers who have shown how naturalism, reductive materialism, the idea that all that exists is the material, physical universe, just doesn't make very good sense. And the conversation is switching now to a lot of these non-natural positions, not supernatural, right? It's kind of this middle ground where they want to say that there are things that exist beyond the material, physical universe. And it's those sort of positions I think we need to focus on. So, stop focusing our attention on yesterday's enemies, right? Reductive materialism, and focus now on more of these non-natural atheistic positions. At least that's my 2 cents and why I'm motivated to do these sort of things with William Lane Craig and Eric Wielenberg, and we're very excited to have Wielenberg to our campus next month to have this conversation up on stage between him and I. I'm looking forward to it greatly. Speaking of which, here's the details. So September 27th, it's a Sunday night at 7 o'clock. It's still on board as of right now to have it at the university. But as you know, with this pandemic, things could change in a heartbeat. So worst case scenario, we'll move it online, right? Or we'll come up with a plan B, but it will take place that evening in some way, shape, or form. September 27th at 7 p.m. But for now, it's scheduled to take place there in the Union on campus. So be sure to join us for that. And I do have a few copies of this book here for sale if you want to buy it from me, or you can just go to Amazon and get it. It's more expensive if you do that, but it's your money. It's your money. You can spend it how you choose. Here's a couple ways you guys can get involved with Ratio Christi. We're going to be tabling on campus. You can stop by and visit our table. Tuesday on East Campus, Wednesday over the lunch hour on City Campus. Stop by and say hi. Wesley sends out an email once a week. If he doesn't have your email address yet, make sure you give him your email address. He sends an update once a week just to let folks know what we're doing, what we're up to, where we're meeting, events. Invite people. We'd love to expand this conversation. We have to promote our group so people know that we're here so that we can engage with them and serve them. That's how we view our ministry, is by serving others. Tell your church, tell your pastors we're here to serve. And since we are an official RSO on campus, you can join and be an official member. You don't have to be a Christian to be a member. Anybody can be a member of Ratio Christi. So we invite you to join. It helps us as we ask for funds from the university. If we have a lot of folks that are a part of our group and members, so we would encourage you to join and be an official member. And the best person to talk to for that would be our president, Matt. All right, well, it's 9 o'clock, but we can take a few questions. If you guys have any questions for me, otherwise I'm happy to turn it over to you guys to let you continue all the good conversations that you've already started. Go ahead.
So, about the idea that what makes something wrong is that if it causes you pain, what would you say if different people find pain in different things and have different ideas of what causes pain?
Yeah, and that's one of the difficulties with utilitarianism, is if you're going to define, morally good that way, well then, okay, how do we define pleasure and pain, right? This is notoriously one of the things utilitarians then struggle with defining. And a lot of people will make fun of them and say, oh, they're just hedonists because they're making pleasure the greatest thing. But they're not that simple, right? When they define pleasure, they usually define it very nuanced and appropriately. So not just carnal pleasures, but like the pleasure of loving relationships, the pleasure of study and work, pleasure that you get from those sort of things. And so in their minds, what they're putting forth as pleasure and the avoidance of pain is very virtuous things, not carnal pleasures like eating chocolate cake, right? Or getting all your sexual desires satisfied all the time whenever you want it. They're not hedonists, utilitarians. They're trying to put forth this idea of moral goodness as the avoidance of pain or the increase of pleasure. And not just as an individual, but as an entire society or an entire population of the human race. But then that becomes difficult too. Well, how do you calculate that? Okay, this action is going to bring pleasure to this group, but it might bring some pain to this group. So how do I calculate that, those utilitarianism, right? How do I calculate that? And just because something is difficult to calculate doesn't mean it's inherently false, but that is one of the difficulties that they struggle with, is what you pointed out. How do you define pain? How do you define pleasure? So my pushback on utilitarians would be the same as Moore's, right? Even though Moore is a non-naturalist and I'm a supernaturalist, we would both critique naturalism, moral realism, the same way. Well, what makes the avoidance of pain good? Why think that that is good? So I would use the same open question argument that Moore would against a utilitarian. All right, other thoughts, questions? Go ahead.
So, when we talk to students our age, you
that people are oriented more naturally?
Yeah, I would say that non-naturalism hasn't caught on yet with students for the most part, but it's usually one of those things that's like a trickle-down situation. Usually ideas will start, at a very high level, intellectual philosophers, scientists, theologians, and then eventually it'll trickle down to the culture, usually through art, honestly. So not many people are reading the philosophers themselves, but a lot of artists do. And then they pass those ideas down through their art. And when I say art, I mean like movies, TV, radio, literature, novels, songs, poetry. And that's how most people in the culture get their ideas, from the philosophers, through the artists, down to the mass culture. And whether we like it or not, entertainment, that's how art works. It influences us. And that's for right or wrong. Good ideas also function that way. There's a reason why Christians have sung hymns for the last 2,000 years, because you communicate truth through an art form, and it's much more powerful that way. Go back to your question, though. Oh, among students. So no, a lot of students that I talk to, at least, and I can only talk about the students that I talk to, usually would affirm, relative morality or subjective morality still. But I see this shift happening at the academic level, and I would foresee, like most things, it is going to trickle down, where most people eventually then would be affirming some form of objective morality, which is encouraging to me in a sense, as I explained. And yeah, I do see still a lot of students who are naturalists, who believe that the physical material universe is all that exists. But that also, I think, is shifting, at least at the academic level, and will trickle down, and has started to a little bit. But it's always hard when you try to ascertain what the majority think, because it's always, all you have usually is anecdotal. I had this conversation, I had that conversation. So as I'm just reading, especially over the last 6 or 7 years, having to read the philosophers themselves, and they're admitting, hey, things are changing at the academic level, as I gave quotes to that effect. Any other questions? Yeah.
Assuming a supernatural origin to morality, how do you get objective duties without violating Hume's law?
What Hume's law are you referring to?
Is it ought? You cannot get a ought statement from an is.
Oh, okay. Maybe lay out for me what you're seeing as a contradiction, or what you're...
Sure. So classically, divine command theory, and I don't know what you described it was, so perhaps you'll have a different approach. But classically, I find that divine command theory suggests that something ought to be done, or something is good because God commands it, or it ought to be done because God commands it. But it seems like a ought statement, or sorry, when God commands something, that is an is statement, and it's not an ought statement, so I can just as easily then ask, why ought I do what God commands? And then we get a infinite loop, where you haven't ever escaped Hume's law.
Yep, I see what you're saying. Yeah, is and ought, that's a problem that a lot of positions have to deal with, is the is-ought problem, not just divine command theory. So it might be easiest for me, instead of having to defend other people's positions, I can just put my cards on the table and defend my position. So yeah, I would affirm that moral obligation does come from God's commands. And this was one of the things that Wielenberg brings up in his debate with Craig, then why ought we obey God's commands? So in my dissertation, I tried to make an argument that it is good to obey God's commands. So and we'll get into this in the next few weeks. So there's two different issues going on in metaethics. There's moral goodness, and then there's moral oughtness, or rightness sometimes. One of them has to do with moral value, something is good or bad, and the other issue has to do with right and wrong. Should you or should you not do something? So you can do a good thing, something that's good, but you're not necessarily obligated to do it. Does that make sense? So I could go and build an orphanage, And everybody would say, well, that's a good thing to do. And most everybody would agree that's a good thing to build an orphanage, but you're not necessarily obligated to do that, right? You don't have to do that. You don't have an obligation to do that. But you'd still say that's a good thing. So we want to make the separation between what is morally good and what is morally obligated, okay? So I tried to make the case and to try my best to end this regress, to end this problem that he's bringing up by showing or arguing why, how the oughtness, how moral rightness is connected to moral goodness. And again, I'm a theist, I'm a Christian, and so I argue that moral oughtness or moral rightness comes from God's commands, just to simplify it. So you might ask, well, why is that good? Why is it good to obey God? So I'm trying to take the two theories in metaethics and connect them, right? Am I making that too complicated? Am I simplifying that enough? Why is obeying God a good thing? So connecting the ought, the moral rightness, to moral goodness. And my position of moral goodness is that something is good if it resembles God. Okay, something is morally good if it resembles God. And so I'm trying to say, why is obeying God's commands a good thing? Well, in summary, and I'll explain this more in a couple of weeks when I go through my entire position, obeying God reflects God. Because I argue that there is obedience within God, the Trinity. So you've got the Son obeying the Father, right, within eternity, all eternity past, the Son obeying the Father, and everything in God is defined as morally good, as I would define it, and other Christian philosophers would define it. So everything that's within God is good, and there's obedience of the Father in God, the Son obeying the Father, so that's good. And then our obedience of the commands is therefore good because it reflects the obedience within God. That's in a nutshell my position of how I try to reconcile those two things. But I would agree with you and Wielenberg that that is an issue that Christians or supernaturalists need to wrestle with and put forth an answer to. Okay, it's not something we can just brush aside. It's something that is an objection to our position that should be dealt with as best as we can, right? Just like any position has strengths, weaknesses, things that need to be addressed. Let's take one more question, if we've got one, and then I'll let you guys figure it all out. Well, I really enjoy this conversation. I hope you can tell. And sometimes it's difficult when you've spent 5, 6, 7 years on something and you try to share it with others. I hope I didn't overwhelm you with technical jargon. I tried to make it as simple as possible so you guys can be introduced to the conversation, because that's what I want you guys to do, is have conversations about this stuff. And I want to give you the tools to do that. So I'll end here, and then you guys are welcome to stay till Ben and Janae kick you out. Thanks, guys.